Alright, so in today's video, I want to talk about how you choose which OT schools to apply to. Again, I feel like there aren't very many videos out there about this. I could be wrong, but I wanted to add my own 2 cents because I've been through the application process now completely and picked a school. Yay! Which I'll make another video about. So I feel like I was happy with which schools I applied to. So I want to give the scaffolding that I used to pick those schools to you so that you can make your own educated decision. The first thing I feel like it's important to know when you're thinking about how many schools to apply to is that it is $150 for your first school that you add to your OTCAS application, and then $65 for every school after that. So that's kind of why, even though most people's intuition is to apply to a bunch of schools, most people stick around that 5 to 7 range because it gets really expensive. There are fee waivers, but it's kind of a first come, first serve basis, and you have to use them 10 days after you get them, from what I understand. I have known people who have applied to 1 or 2, and I've also known people who have applied to 9. It's just kind of your own comfort level. I applied to 5. In case you're wondering. So there's a lot of pressure with those numbers to get your pick right. And I don't want to minimize that. So where do you even start? Oops, we lost our son a little. So the first place I started was picking like a homing location, which for me is kind of the in-between between my parents' house and my boyfriend's parents' house, because that's where most of our family is located and where we end up traveling for birthdays and holidays. So that's been the biggest deal with being 4 hours away where I am currently. For you, that can be entirely different. Maybe there's a city you love or something else that you know you want to be able to access in a certain amount of time. Or maybe there's not, and then it's going to be much harder for you. But anyway, at first I was like, alright, I would go 13 hours away from this location, which was like a random number, but I felt like, alright, in one day I could drive 13 hours. It would suck, but I could do it. But then I thought about it more, and honestly, I wouldn't be willing to drive that far. If I really gave myself the mental picture of, alright, there's an emergency in your family and you have to, drive to be with them from that place. Anything upwards of like 6 hours is way too long of a drive and makes me nervous to be that far away. But, to each their own. So after I had that spot and my number of hours, I made kind of a radius around that spot. And in those states were the states I would be willing to apply. So then I went on to I also have another lovely script down here that I'm reading from. I went on to the ACOTE website, which I will link below, and filtered by those states in their schools section, and it showed me all of the schools in those states that are in the process of accreditation or accredited, which we'll talk a little bit about later. Then I made a very large spreadsheet. I do not recommend doing this. I will link it below, even though the information will be outdated, if not completely wrong, for you to look at if you want to see. But it was a lot of work. It was during the pandemic, so it was like my end of my sophomore year, and I just had a lot of free time on my hands, and a lot of worry about the future. But there's definitely not a need to do that much. What I would suggest is making a spreadsheet or a document that looks at the distance from where you want to be, the number of shadowing hours they require, their graduation rate, their NBCOT pass rate, which I'll link below how you can figure that out, and then their prerequisites, or a slot for prerequisites, tuition, and accreditation status. So that's 7 things. It is a lot of things. You don't want to go filling all of those things out for everybody. You want to do it kind of more systematically. That is, if you follow how I did it. So the first thing that I did was I looked at their prerequisites, because some schools require, for example, neuroanatomy. My university didn't have neuroanatomy. I didn't know of any school that I could easily access that did. So I knew that any school that required that, it didn't make sense for me to apply to. The other thing I saw a lot of was schools that required anatomy with a cadaver lab, which at least in my area, it is very hard for a undergraduate student to have that type of experience. So yeah, those were immediately off my list. So once you have that out of the way, you can move on to another category, and so on and so forth. And for each one where you find a school that you think, no, I wouldn't do that, you can take it off your list and just stop at that category. So that should lessen the amount of work you have to do, hopefully. Depends on how large your radius is and how do you sort through it. So what I did was I picked the category that was most important to me and I gave it the highest number of points. So let's say there were, 8 categories or sections. So my top category would have been their accreditation status. So I would have given that category 8 points. And then if they had a full accreditation, they got 8 full points, and so on down the list. And then the next category, which for me was like distance from home, that one would be worth 7 points. And I would give, if they had the closest range, they'd get the full 7 points, and so on down. Once you've given everybody their points in each category, you total them up, and you can just align them from most points to least points, and the top, however many you're willing to apply to, those are your schools. I did want to talk a little about accreditation status because I really struggled to figure that out. I don't understand why they do it this way, and I'm just going to give you what I vaguely understand. It might not be right. You should definitely look it up on your own. So the way accreditation works for OT schools is that they make a program, they make a curriculum, and they apply to the accreditation board. The accreditation board checks them over, and if it looks okay, they are granted the status of candidacy. So first you're an applicant, then once they've looked at your curriculum, you're a candidate, and you can start accepting students. So I actually applied to one program that was in the applicant stage, and they could not send me an acceptance letter until they were granted candidacy. When they're in the candidacy stage, then the next thing they have to do is bring their students up through the program. I am not sure. I think the next stage is pre-accreditation. And so that's when their first class kind of graduates and is allowed to sit for the NBCOT exam. Depending on how they do, they might be granted accreditation. So, all of that in mind, the biggest thing to know is that if your school is not fully accredited, it means that there is a chance that you will not be able to get your OT licensure and sit for the NBCOT exam. So if I were to enter a program that was even in pre-accreditation, which there was a school that I applied to that was in pre-accreditation, and their class sits for the NBCOT and bombs it, the review board might say, all right, it's clear that even though we thought you were doing good, you're not, so we are not going to grant you accreditation. Say I am the class behind them and I've been in this school for 2.5 years or something, and I thought that next year I'd be able to sit for the exam and get my licensure. I can no longer do that, and I am either stuck in the program until they reach accreditation or are allowed to let another class sit. I'm not quite sure how that works. Or I can leave the program. Either way, I am on the hook for all of my loans I took out. There is no reimbursement for the tuition I have paid, and a lot of the time, the credits I took do not transfer to other institutions. There are some that will do that, but basically it's a gamble. Now, in my area, there are very few accredited institutions, so it was very nerve wracking applying, because if you only get into one of these programs that's not accredited, I understand feeling like you have to go. So keep that in mind. Another thing you can consider is that, so the NBC OT pass rate that I talked about, that's again the licensure exam. So after you finish the program, you have to take that before you're allowed to practice. So some schools are really early in the accreditation process, but it's because they're a doctoral program. So a lot of master's programs made the switch because the board pushed for everyone to make the switch because they were going to make it mandatory that programs had to be a doctorate and not a master's level. So you can check what their scores were when they were a master's program. And it's a lot safer knowing that they have had all these great scores when they were masters. We just don't have any with their students being doctoral students, which for the most part the difference should only be the research and capstone coursework. So those are safer than a school that is just completely brand new and doesn't have any like sister programs that are, post-professional OTDs, or they have a master's and this is just their doctorate program. So those are the things to keep in mind. I hope this has given you a little bit of help picking which schools to apply to, and as always, best of luck.